Thank you, and thanks a lot for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here and happy to hopefully get to talk to lots of you folks over the next 3 days. So what I'm going to be talking about, as Sunshine said, is kind of one big family of strategies for thinking about how to protect natural systems and all of the ecosystem services that are provided by those natural systems over the long term. So kind of the big question that this group of strategies is addressing is, how do you conserve whole systems and all of their diversity in a continually changing climate? So I come from a really organismal background. I worked on migratory songbirds for my PhD. You know, when you think about how diverse all of the different combinations of species are and sites that we might be interested in conserving, and think about all of the individual different responses that those species and systems might have to all of the different ways that the climate is going to change, your brain gets numb really fast. And so this is really a strategy that's appealing in some ways because it lets you sort of blur a lot of those details and focus in on aspects of a changing climate that can hopefully be supported by focusing on features that are not changing, or at least not changing as quickly. So the three pieces of what I'm going to talk about are listed here on this left side of the slide. The first is focusing on the foundation. That's basically what we're calling the geophysical stage, or the land facet. So it's a look at the geology that underlies ecological systems. The second piece is focusing on sites or locations that are complex in terms of the topography, because that gives you some variation in exposure to climate. We all know that high altitude areas tend to be cooler than low, those kinds of factors. And also places that are permeable, and that basically just means connected so that things can move through them. And the last piece that I'm not going to talk about today much, but I have a feeling that we might hear from Molly about this, and probably Lara too, is maintaining connectivity across the landscape. And so there's a large group of folks at the Nature Conservancy where I work that are tackling different pieces of this in different geographies. And I have a handout here that shows kind of the geographies where we've worked so far that'll be available up here. And if I run out of copies, I have it on a jump drive too. But that also links down to some of our site scale adaptation work that's been funded through the WCS Adaptation Fund that I know Molly will talk about. So the main thing about that handout is it has a lot of contact people that hopefully there's at least one person in the geography where you work that you could get in touch for more information. So this is the map I just showed. I want to just call out that I'm project manager for applying these methods in the center of the country, but we just started about 4 months ago, so I don't have any results yet. The folks that have really pioneered these approaches have been working primarily in the East Coast. That's Mark Anderson. We just had a session this morning. He's around and will hopefully be at the Nature Conservancy's booth at some point. I'm sure he'll be at the bar this evening at some point. So he's a good person to talk to. And then also Steve Buttrick, who's in the Oregon chapter, might also be at the bar with Mark. So, oh gosh, I shouldn't say that on recording, but it's true. Again, these folks are really interested in sharing this work, so I want to just give you their names so you can look for them. So as I said, I started on the organismal side, working on migratory birds. And I'm showing this image here from work by Jeff Price and Patty Glick way back in 2002, because this is one of the first things that I was working on when I first started in ecology and thinking about how do we think about climate change. And this was the type of information that I used to do a lot of, just synthesis of likely impacts or responses to climate change. And one of the reasons that this particular figure got a lot of play was because the Baltimore Oriole was projected, if you look from the gray map to the orange, to no longer be found in Baltimore. So I think ecologists for a long time were really just gathering all these different examples of impacts and more impacts and more impacts. And it's taken us a lot longer to get to the point of, okay, what do we do about it? So that's what all these adaptation strategies are about. So what the mapping terrestrial resilience projects, we also call them conserving nature stage projects, are trying to do is basically improve the resilience of a site. And I can see Molly's gonna like, oh, not that word. It's hard because it's so everywhere that we're going to use it, but at least I'm gonna try to define it. Resilience, the way we're using it here is to talk about a site in particular at that scale, and talk about how the physical aspects of that site come together to help maintain species diversity and ecological functions over time. And so this is, it can be used in a lot of other ways, and that's an important thing to think about on the communication side, but that's how I'm talking about resilience. And the approach that we're talking about for trying to map resilience is to basically divide landscapes into these geophysical settings depending on, again, their geology, elevation, other aspects of what the land looks like, basically. And first, make sure that we've got some of all of those different types in our conservation portfolio. The first rule is, save all the parts kind of thing. The second piece is within each of those system types, try to find the examples of those types that seem the most likely to retain species diversity over the long term. So you're going to be comparing flat coastal plains to other flat coastal plains, not comparing them to alpine systems on granite, for example, because they're going to be really different. They're going to, over the long term, support different suites of species. But we want to make sure we've got all of them, and we want to make sure we try to find the best examples. So assumption number one that underlies this work, I think you've already heard this one. Geophysical features underlie the spatial distributions of biodiversity, and a region's biological richness is due, in part at least, to this diversity. So this is just a geology map. I remember when I was an undergrad, I was always jealous of the geology majors because they had these gigantic maps in their rooms, and late at night there would be a lot of sitting around and staring at them in different altered states. But so you can see obviously that there's a lot of geology, variation in geology across the US. So this is what we're talking about. And again, this is not likely to change as quickly as species distributions. So what Mark Anderson's team in the East has done is take these geological maps and then basically chop up different landscapes into chunks based on what kind of geology underlies them, and then different strata related to elevation. And saying, okay, here's these high altitude granite sites, here's these low elevation sand sites. Let's use those as our units and then try to figure out what are the best examples of each. And obviously the first thing you want to do is just make sure that when you do that and you divide up the land in those kinds of units, that you're still capturing species diversity on those stages of geology. And so one of his first real tests of this came out in 2010. And this graph here is basically showing the correlation between the predicted number of species and the actual number of species using the state scale as the metric. So how many species do you have in each state relative to the number of geological settings? Is there a relationship between the number of geological settings that you have in a state and the species? And you can see by the strong clustering of the points around that line that the relationship that he found was really strong. Obviously, there's a lot of other ways that you can test these, and there are a lot of other places where this has been tested, and the relationship has not been as strong. So it's this kind of art and science of figuring out what are the best predictors that are on your landscape for the long term, and what are they predicting, and how do we use them? I don't get to read poetry very often in science, and this was an example that ended up getting used in a special section of the journal Conservation Biology that's focused on these approaches. It's by Annie Dillard, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's a great piece that starts out by saying, life is a gloss on geography, and if you dig your fists into the earth and crumble geography, you strike geology. Climate is a wind of minerals, earth, rondeur, tilt, and orbit modified by local geological conditions. And the part that I really love goes into the variation between salamanders and what I think of as fiddle-playing relatives on my side in North Carolina. Just that we all know that these patterns exist on the landscape. We all know that species are associated with different types of habitats and different types of altitude, and we know that people vary along the same things. And I think that one of the most compelling reasons for thinking about this strategy is that it's really easy to communicate. If you capture all that diversity in the underlying setting, you've got a really good chance of doing a good job of, over the long term, capturing all the things that will be dancing on that surface, even as the specific dancers change. So the first piece I mentioned that you do with this is just making sure you've got examples of all those different types of settings under conservation. I know these look like some kind of very cryptic code, but they're basically the geophysical settings for the east with the altitude first and then the type of geology. And so the first test is just saying, what proportion of each of those is under some form of conservation. And if everything was roughly equally proportionally protected, all those lines would be, at the same level. But you can see that we protected a lot along the top, those alpine sites, cold rocks, a lot of those are under protection. A lot of these places down here where there's very low protection are things that are good soils for agriculture and things like that. So our first piece is just trying to balance out a little bit more of that protection. The second piece is then thinking about how do we identify the most resilient parts. So assumption 2, microclimate diversity and local permeability convey a level of resilience to a landscape site. So we have the settings. Now how do we subdivide them and find the ones that are likely to offer the most options for moving species? This is just an image of topographic variation, something that you can get from what's called a digital elevation model, a DEM in GIS. And this is just conveying the idea that topography controls the distribution of moisture and nutrients and exposure to solar radiation. So if you have species that are, again, within a granite-based system or a sand-based system, but they've got more topography, they've got more options in terms of the local climate they're experiencing to be able to move around and persist longer. In the same way, if you've got species that are shifting up from the south, there'll be more options here for them to get situated and potentially persist in this landscape if there is more diversity. Okay, the second piece here is thinking about the local permeability. So the approach here is basically to look at the land cover in a particular region and say how much of that is suitable for species to be moving through it. And in this example, where it's starting out with 4 different focal points and saying how far can things move out if we assume that natural habitat allows movement a lot easier than agricultural fields, and maybe cities allow the lowest movement. And this is basically indicated by the fact that the dot around A is very small. It's right in an urban center. Not a lot of flow can come outward. And then B, C, and D are shifting out towards areas where there is more natural habitat, and so potentially could have more movement. This bottom map is then linking all those different individually focused analyses into a surface that helps you say, okay, things could move a lot more easily here, less easily there. And that's one way of just thinking about if we've got a particular site type and we've got some topographic diversity, again, some climate variation that species could move to, are they going to be able to get there? So that's the second piece. And this is just an example from Mark's work on what the summary maps look like. So basically, being able to provide this to a landscape conservation cooperative, which is a network within a region that's federal and state and NGOs working together to design conservation. You can bring this in and say, okay, this is how we see your landscape. Each of these is stratified, again, by that geological setting, so you're only comparing like to like. And you can say, okay, we've got some of these places in the green that are far above average in terms of how much variation they have and how easy it is for species to move through that system, and some places that are far below average. And so while you can potentially use this in a lot of different ways, you can use it both to say, here's where we need to make sure we conserve some of these highly resilient areas. And then you can also say, with these places that are way on the far below, those might be the places that we manage towards transitioning to a different system more quickly, because they're already in one of those places where their vulnerability is very high. So there's a lot of different ways to use this information. One way that the Nature Conservancy is using it is to evaluate our own conservation portfolios. So this is an example from the work in the West. And each of those little colored blobs is one place that's been identified as a high priority based on species distributions and high biodiversity. This is taking that same map and looking at it again and saying, what proportion of that area came out as highly resilient in these other assessments? So it allows us to bring together the species and the resilience information in one map. This is an example of a way that thinking about this geophysical diversity and topographic diversity has been brought into a broader framework that's used far beyond TNC. This is an example of the Yale Framework, and there are 6 recommendations for thinking about adaptation in a conservation planning setting. And just, again, an example of where these things are being used. Similarly, this is a tool that some of my colleagues from the New York State chapters of TNC will be talking about on Thursday in a session called Getting Unstuck. The main idea here is to provide a resource that can be incorporated with other data sets that people are using to make decisions, whether that's projections for land use change, whether that's current distributions of species. It's meant to be brought in with lots of other types of information and incorporated and weighted depending on what the folks in the room think is important and what they're trying to do in terms of their planning process. This is where I will end. There's some more resources up on TNC's website for these 2 projects. And then I mentioned that conservation biology special session. And I also have a lot of handouts up here that I'd be happy to share.